Okay, so here's a couple of examples of how we account for selling our receivables with and without recourse. Okay, so this is the first situation is without recourse. You've got this company, Wood, who's selling $150,000 of their receivables without recourse to the factoring company. The factoring company has a 2% finance charge they charge, and they keep 6% of the proceeds to cover sales returns and allowances. So how these problems work is the accounts receivable of 150 were sold, they come off the books. The loss on the sale represents the fee, okay? That's the finance charge that is charged, and that's always going to be the loss on the sale. So that's the 150,000 times the 2% finance charge. And then this, they retain 6% to cover sales returns and allowances. These are things that will be settled as time goes on, but that would be a due from the factor to Wood Company. In other words, and that's the 6%. And so they'll have some sales returns and allowances, and whatever amounts are appropriate will be remitted back to the company sort of at the end of the period. Okay, so this is sales without recourse. The factor that bought the receivables is responsible for any bad debts. They cannot go back to Wood Company and say, oh, now so-and-so didn't pay, we've got to collect that from you. So this is without recourse. It's important to distinguish between the due from factor, that involves sales returns and allowances and sales discounts. Totally separate item from the recourse liability, or when it's done with recourse, and that has to do with the bad debts, the uncollectible accounts. So let's see how it would work if we're doing this with recourse. Okay, so sales with recourse, we're going to do the same thing. We will have the accounts receivable come off the books. You're going to have that same 2% finance charge, but you're also going to have, they've estimated the recourse liability to have a fair value of $7,500. This is the sort of the amount that they expect they might not collect, and that is a liability that Wood Company is going to have to pay the factoring company for any uncollectible accounts up to that amount. So when we account for this, the receivables come off, you take 2% finance charge, that's going to be part of the loss. The rest of the loss is going to be this $7,500. So your loss on the receivables is the finance charge plus the recourse liability. So the $7,500 plus whatever that was before. Okay? And so then you have the due from factor is the same 6%, and that's for the sales returns allowances and sales discounts. Okay. Obviously, companies would like to account for these sales as a sale rather than having a recourse liability in there, but that does have to be accounted for. One thing that the companies, well, FASB has a lot of requirements on this. It gets into a lot more complexity on it. But certain conditions have to be met for it to be called a sale of receivables. And so you have to be aware of what those conditions are. Okay, so you have, so FASB requirements to call it a sale. The receivables have been isolated from the seller or the transferor, and the buyer of the receivables has the right to pledge or exchange the receivables. In other words, the factor has to have control of the receivables to call it a sale. And if those conditions aren't met, it has to be recorded as a liability. And we'll get more into why that's an issue later on. Credit cards, MasterCard and Visa, are a form of factoring arrangement. The retailer will charge the customer the full price for each credit card sale. The credit company does all the collections, but they assess a finance charge on each transaction. And so that's to cover the collection costs of the credit card company. And the risk of non-collection usually resides with the credit card company unless there's been some kind of fraud involved on the part of the retailer or negligence. Okay, so factoring with and without recourse, you basically need to work through these 2 basic journal entries on it, and that's probably about as complicated as we will get with it.